There's so much promising research and there's so many fantastic solutions. I feel like this is the, multi-billion dollar opportunity that's hiding in plain sight. So why wouldn't we lean in? It's not just a gap. I mean, there's a huge canyon we can fill of products for women.
Some investments chase returns, others shift reality. Welcome to Blind Spot Capital, the show where we trace the capital flows, structural decisions, and invisible forces shaping the future of health. We go deep on what's overlooked, underfunded, or misunderstood, especially where women's health, longevity, and AI intersect. Because this isn't just about the next big trend, it's about who gets seen and who gets funded. Welcome back to Blind Spot Capital, the show where we surface the markets people overlook and the investors who move before mainstream does. If you're new here or you've been listening quietly, now's the time to subscribe and share this episode because this one matters. So my guest today in the studio with me is someone who didn't just see the blind spot in women's health. She built a public company to do something about it. Sabrina Matucci-Johnson is the founder and CEO of Dare Bioscience, a NASDAQ-listed biopharma company developing new products across contraception, fertility, vaginal health, sexual function, menopause, you name it. If it's been underserved, Dare is working on it. Now, what makes Sabrina's story remarkable isn't just what she's building, but it's where she's come from and what she chose to walk away from. She started her career in the healthcare industry, rose through finance and operations, becoming CFO, COO, and eventually president of the companies working at the intersection of science, global health, and capital markets. She's launched products, led M&A, delivered returns. But in 2015, she paused, looked around, and realized that the products that mattered the most to women, the ones that could change lives, weren't being built. Not because the science wasn't good, but because nobody was funding them. And that's the moment that conviction kicked in. She didn't wait for the system to change. She built a new one. So if you're ready, we're ready to talk about this. Sabrina, welcome to the show.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I'm really excited about our conversation.
I'm really glad that we're here. Sabrina, so let's go back to 2010. You had 13 years of working in various leadership positions at a handful of bioscience and healthcare companies. What made you walk away from that path and into women's health?
Yeah, at that time, I had worked, as you mentioned, in a lot of different therapeutic areas. And a couple of the therapeutic areas I had worked in were conditions that primarily affected women. So it really got me thinking about opportunities to work in women's health. And as I had that interest and commitment in working in women's health, what I saw was exactly what you described, that pharmaceutical companies were leaning out when what I saw was a real opportunity here to lean in, right? What I was finding was products for women. It was a graveyard of stalled innovation, but really great opportunities, right? That had promising research and could be real solutions in women's health. And what was lacking was a company to lean in and do that work.
So you saw this gap, products not coming to market. So what did that pivot teach you about innovation and its limits? Because you were seeing products being sort of innovated, but not actually quite getting to the users that needed. What was the disconnect you saw between sort of science and the funding?
Yeah. So if you think about how innovation can happen, right? The first step you need is to have that promising research. And I was definitely seeing that. I was seeing the promising research. I was seeing the potential for real solutions. But to move them forward, right, to move these potential high impact treatments into becoming actually products, right, that women can use, you need to take them through development, right?
Yeah.
So what I was seeing was these weren't bad ideas. They were just ideas that no one was funding. And I think that's really a key, right, as we think about innovation, right? How does innovation happen?
Mm-hmm.
It takes that great idea, that great concept, but then you also need that capital, right? That investor to lean in and see that opportunity so that you can move that forward to the finish line. So it wasn't a lack of good opportunities. It was a lack of investor knowledge and investor conviction.
So when you started raising capital, you started raising venture money, for example, for Dare, what surprised you the most? about investor knowledge or investor reactions?
What I saw was that lack of conviction, right? And what causes conviction is knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I was seeing was it wasn't that they couldn't understand the potential for the total addressable market. Let's take contraception as an example, right? It was very easy to explain to someone that there are 65 million women in the US alone, right, that need to think about contraception, but they never looked at a contraceptive before, right? So if you've never evaluated a contraceptive before as a venture capital fund, you don't know what you don't know. And it
Yes.
becomes a little more challenging, right, for that fund to then have that conviction that it needs. So it becomes more of an education process, right? And that's what I really saw when I was trying to raise VC money in women's health. One, I'm mostly pitching to men. So they don't have a natural just awareness of the conditions. And two, typically as a fund, they have never invested in that
Mm.
condition before. And so the education process ends up being longer, right? And that also then impacts their risk reward equation and how they're going to make that investment.
Yes, that is so true. It's something that I also see every day in my line of work. But let's talk about Dare, because you chose to take Dare public before a single product was commercial. That's rare. Why?
Well, I can assure you that it was not like a vanity play on my part for sure. You know, what I saw was as I described in the venture capital world, where that's usually where you get your first money as
Yes.
a private company. They just hadn't been doing the investments in women's health. And what does that mean? That means there weren't exits that they could point to. There wasn't that proof that they could point to, right? There was a lot of education that was necessary because a venture capital firm, when they're making an investment, they're making a 3, 5, 7 year bet,
Yep.
right? Before there's an opportunity for them to have an exit and transact on that. And so it was so much that I was needing to teach them. It was very different from the public markets, where the public markets, right? They're just looking at, wow, is this a good investment? Is this a good bet for today? Because they know in the public market, you can transact every day if you want to, right?
Yes.
So it's a lot easier to get them excited, right? Everyone can understand the unmet need, but for a venture
Yes.
firm, right, they're looking at that longer horizon. And
Yes.
whereas a public investor can say, is it a good bet today? If it's a good bet today, I'm in. And for what we were building at Dare, that was really a better vehicle for us to get the investment that we needed to build the company we were building.
Yeah. And talking about the company you're building with Dare, let's maybe talk about your portfolio, because as I said, if it's underserved, Dare is working on it and you work across the spectrum. How do you decide what to bring into the Dare pipeline?
Yeah, it's a great question. First and foremost, right, we're very laser focused on closing the gap between promising research and real solutions in women's health. So when you take that as your foundation, right, that means we're really specializing, as I talked about, in taking these high potential treatments, identifying them in areas that have been historically underfunded and overlooked, but have really high potential, and then moving them forward right in the development process. So the through line then, as you think about our products and our portfolio, while the therapeutic areas we work in are very broad,
Mm,
every single product, we have to be able to look at that product and it has to stand on its own accord and being able to solve a persistent unmet need, an obvious problem,
mm-hmm.
be truly differentiated, right? So it's something that pharma has left behind, but the solution is a truly differentiated solution to address that problem. So that's how we think about, right, our portfolio, that clear unmet need and that clear solution that is a beautiful match for that unmet need.
Yeah. Now, talking about unmet needs, as you know, Sabrina, I run a newsletter where we have about 11,000 or 12,000 followers. And one of the things that we've been talking about lately on the newsletter is the topic of, well, it's an unmet need, but it's one that isn't talked about a lot. And I think it's also a problem with women's health, being that a lot of women's health problems are seen as personal.
Yeah.
So we don't talk about these things. But one of the things we've been talking about quite a bit, because I think given the demographics of my following, we have quite a lot of midlife women. And one
Yep.
of the things that's been coming up is menopause, premenopause, menopause, but also the impact on libido.
Yes.
And also women going through, say, cancer treatment. And we'll be talking a lot about hormones, the relationship and or not with, with cancer, or women that have gone through cancer. And, one of the side effects is libido. So that is something that in a closed community, we have been talking about and exploring quite a bit. This is something I hear a lot from my community. And so what are you most excited about in Dari's pipeline right now? Is this something that you're working on, or what are you excited about?
Yeah, there are a few things. I mean, obviously, I love everything in the pipeline, right? Because our portfolio is very broad, and I love all my babies,
Yes.
from contraception to menopause and sexual health. And they're all exciting because all of them are really redefining innovation. But to your question, and expanding choices, which is so important, and particularly in areas like contraception. But what I get really excited about in the portfolio are the products that are kind of nearer term, right? So some of them are earlier stage and have fantastic impact, such as our product for women who have undergone cancer treatment, breast cancer treatment, and are suffering with vaginal symptoms that can come from that treatment, the pain, the discomfort, and being able to give them an option, or women who are testing positive for human papillomavirus infection and are just watching and waiting for it to become pre-cancer before anyone will do anything about it. So I'm passionate about the impact we're making there and the opportunities for IVF, for it to be, your progesterone that you need for IVF to be less painful, and make it
Yes.
easy on the woman. But the ones I'm super excited about today are the ones that are really, they're tangible. We're so close. So one of them is our hormone-free monthly contraception product
Yes.
candidate, Ovaprene, which is in its last stage of human testing. We actually just announced some positive interim data this week in terms of its impact, recently, in terms of its impact on reducing that risk of unintended pregnancy and its safety profile. So I'm obviously very excited about that. And we have a
Yes.
partnership with Bayer to commercialize it ultimately. But I'm also super excited right now, no pun intended, about our product, Sildenafil Cream. We call it Dare to Play Sildenafil Cream, which we are developing uh, for the symptoms of arousal. And
Mm,
specifically, and you kind of touched on this, that at various stages of our lives as women, we can have the same challenges that men with
mm,
erectile dysfunction have, which is
mm,
if you don't have enough blood flow to the genital tissue, it will impact the ability to have a physical arousal response. And it's all a cycle. If you don't have that physical blood flow, it's going to
yes.
be uncomfortable. You're not going to get the lubrication. You're less likely to have as pleasurable of experience overall. And so we've been developing this and evaluating this in women, and we're going to be able to bring it to market later this year in parallel while we're still pursuing a longer term strategy with the FDA. We're going to be able to bring it to market later this year for women so that they can have access to something that's actually evidence based and have a trusted source. So excited about that, right? To have that impact.
That is exciting for women all over. That is really exciting. So I'm rooting for you
Thank
a
you.
lot with
Thank
that.
you.
Now, Sabrina, pharma has pulled back from women's health.
Yeah.
And when I listen to you, to your product pipeline, to your plans, you are leaning in. Why?
I talked about, right, we're kind of filling that gap between that really promising research and right there, that's why we're leaning in. There's so much promising research and there's so many fantastic solutions. I feel like this is the, multi-billion dollar opportunity that's hiding in plain sight. So why wouldn't we lean in? It's not just a gap. I mean, there's a huge canyon we can fill of products for women. And so we intend to be that solution for women and for pharma as well, right? The company that they can partner with and come back to. And for women, knowing that we're that trusted source of solutions for them and solutions for the conditions that, to the point you made earlier, maybe they've been uncomfortable talking about, right? That have been stigmatized. Let's have those conversations and let's give them the products that they deserve.
Yeah. I want to step back a bit. to talk about the vehicle in which you work. You are a publicly listed company. And I think one of the things, with a publicly listed company, of course, think for investors, you have that flexibility. You can go in and out, so liquidity is not an issue. But on the flip side, we see how public markets trade. Sometimes it's, the market can be irrational for a long time. And sometimes you have this sort of hype. You have stocks getting hyped and the market is just on a tear without actually matching the fundamentals. So you've had to sort of earn credibility in a market that rewards hype. What's the cost of staying mission aligned in that sort of environment?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because when you're publicly traded, it really is, what'd you do for me this quarter?
Mm.
Right. And biology does not work in quarter increments, right? It takes longer to develop products and generate data. And particularly, like we talked about, if we're going to be the company, which we are, that is truly science backed and truly evidence based and focused on bringing these credible solutions for women, it means that we have to do the hard work. And I'll give you a great example as it relates to that product we were just talking about, our Dare to Play Sildenafil Cream. It would be easy, right, to just develop a marketing brand that is all hype, right, about arousal and what we might be able to do. And it's the same active ingredient that's in Viagra, and not generate the evidence, right? But if you want to bring a true solution to women, you have to do the work. And that means, let's take arousal. Do the work to understand how women even talk about it. What would improvement be, right? What would be meaningful to them, right? Asking those questions, taking the time before we even assess how our product is doing, is understanding, what are you looking for, right? And then doing the work to demonstrate that in a clinical trial. So there are definitely times in our development programs where it would be easy to go fast. And it might be tempting to go fast so that we can have the soundbite and the, quarterly update. But in the long run, for our investors, right, all of our stakeholders are investors, clinicians, women. That's really not the right answer, right? The right answer is to generate the data that's going to support a very successful brand. And how do you build a successful brand? It's with understanding the unmet need, making sure your product is truly differentiated and demonstrating it, right? It's defining it and then it's demonstrating. And so that's what we take the time to do. And, work hard to keep our investors updated on that. But yeah, as I said up front, biology doesn't work in quarters and good science doesn't work in quarters, but we're building a foundation of growth and value. And that comes with the good science, the, defining it and demonstrating it.
I'm smiling because you said something that reminded me of a paper I read last week. As I said, in our community, this is a topic, arousal, that women have been talking about. So it's really front and center in my mind because the community has been talking about it. Yeah. And I was reading a paper about a product which, the promise is that it helps women with arousal. And the results were that women that took part in the trial had at least one sexually satisfying event. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, what exactly does that mean?
Right.
What exactly does that mean?
Right. Yeah. And was it satisfactory because your kids didn't interrupt, or there wasn't a knock at the door? Or was it satisfactory because it was actually pleasurable?
Exactly. Yeah. What does that mean?
Exactly. I hear you.
Coming back to the fact that you're working with a public company, on a serious note, has that helped or hurt your ability to stay on course? What would you say?
So it's a lot of work to be a public company, right? It comes with cost. It comes with, we just talked about the quarterly, right? What'd you do for me this quarter? And the reason there's that mindset is because you're giving quarterly reports and quarterly updates and quarterly guidance. So it was a big decision on my part to take the company public and to capitalize the company in that way. But it really was the vehicle, right, to build the company that could truly activate against, I joked about earlier, right? These are billion-dollar opportunities in women's health that are hiding in plain sight. But to activate those opportunities, we need to have the capital. And we also talked about the fact that our portfolio is broad, right? We're not a company built on one thing that maybe I invented or someone invented. We're a company built on what are the biggest problems? What are the best solutions? Let's put them together and let's get them to the finish line.
Yeah.
And that means we need access to capital, and we need access to capital across a lot of different therapeutic areas where people can get excited. And the public markets is really a great vehicle, right,
Mm-hmm.
for that. So I think it's helped us ultimately stay mission aligned.
Yeah.
Uh, right. Even though we talked about sometimes we have to make those hard choices between we're not going to hype, we're going to do the right work. And
Yes.
sometimes you have to make those hard choices, but ultimately it's allowed us to stay mission aligned because it's given us the capital, right, needed to do the work. And ultimately that's the goal in the end.
So talking about investors, what would you want early investors to ask themselves before passing on a women's health company?
So first of all, if I got $1 for every time someone said women's health is a niche investment opportunity, I'd
Yeah.
personally be a billionaire. I wish that they would take the time initially to even think logically about what they just said.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Think about that. How can it be niche? We're half the population,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The
Um,
math is not mathing.
yeah, the like think about it for a second. And so I wish that sometimes they would take a minute to think about if the addressable market isn't seeming big enough to them, I think they
Mm-hmm.
haven't done the work, right? To think about the market or do those patient interviews or do those provider interviews. Those can be
Yes.
so meaningful and powerful in helping to explain an unmet need. So I would encourage investors before they pass on an opportunity like this that logically, if you think about, should have such big potential to do a little bit of the work. And it's not hard. Call five of your friends who might be doctors,
Mm-hmm.
right? Talk to some women.
Yes.
So very fundamentally, if the markets aren't seeming big enough, you probably didn't look hard enough to understand what's truly going on there.
Yeah. If I also had to get $1 every time I heard women's health is niche, we would have a lot of money to invest into women's health
We
because
would.
we,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
But as you rightly said, I think there is a lot of education that we have to do. And when I speak also to lots of founders in women's health, and I think that's sort of it. The sad thing is you are walking into a pitch and you spend, half of the time just educating on
Yes.
why you're here, and which is incredibly sad. It's also the reason why we decided to start this podcast, because we really truly feel that the ecosystem,
Yeah.
there should be people like advocates or
Yes.
strategists who are doing this work, such that when the founder is in the room pitching, we're talking about the solution and not
Exactly.
actually talking about why we're
Right.
even here in the first
Right.
place.
Right.
So what would have made it easier, in your view, for the next Sabrina to get here faster, to get to where you are faster?
I'll tell you the thing that does not help is when there is too much hype or there's too many products out there that are not science backed
Mm-hmm.
and are not evidence based, or
Yes.
even if they are science backed and evidence based, that we're not truly differentiated, right? Me Too products in any therapeutic category do not do well commercially,
Yes.
typically,
Yes.
right? And products that are, overhyped and over promising and under delivering also don't help, right?
Yeah.
They don't help. Therefore, we need, as developers, right, to have a lot of credibility as we go out there. So, what's going to make it easier for the next set of Sabrinas and founders, right, to succeed in women's health is to have more and more of us truly be credible
Yes.
developers in this space. And then, I also look to the investors, right? Because when they're funding hype, right, when they're funding products that are not differentiated or not science
Yes.
backed or not evidence based, that's also not helping because those products tend to not do as well commercially. So, I think what's going to help all of us is a funding system where the funders are listening and
Yes.
are doing the work, and that as developers and innovators that we're also responsible
Yeah.
about, developing products that have real promise
Yeah.
to serve an unmet need, and that we don't overhype them or overpromise what we can do.
Sabrina, thank you so, so much. It's not just for what you're building, really, but also for the way that you're building it, with precision, with conviction, with zero tolerance for the idea that women's health should come last. So thank you so much for what you're doing. It
Yes.
hasn't been an easy road, but you are doing it with such care and precision. And I thank you for that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And to everyone listening, if this episode made you rethink something, then share it. Share it with an investor, with a founder, or with a policymaker. And hit subscribe if you haven't already. We're not here to stay quiet. So until next time, keep your eye on the blind spots. That's where the real signals are hiding. Thank you and see you next time. That's it for this episode of Blind Spot Capital. If you learned something, share it. And if you're building something, reach out. And if you're investing in the future, make sure you're not doing it blind.